Hi there. Isn't this pretty? My sweetheart got it for me for Valentine's Day one year. It's definitely a hand wash with that metallic on there. Beautiful translucent porcelain. It's a pretty one. Definitely a hand wash. Alrighty. Well, here we are for this day in history, September 26. And you might wonder, what is the deal with this day in history? And I got to tell you, when I was a kid, it seemed like history ought to be boring. But then at some point, I kind of got onto the idea of history as, if I could think of history as more of an elegant form of gossip. That was something I could relate to. And I am curious about what happened, what has happened. I'm curious about what happens in my neighborhood, in my city, and I'm curious about what happens in the world, and I'm curious about what happened before. I can't possibly learn it all or share it all, but I can find out a little bit each day. And I'll tell you about it, and, there you go. So, on with this day in history for September 26, and we're going to start back in 1850 when Drake circumnavigates the globe. English seaman Francis Drake returns to Plymouth, England in the Golden Hind, that's the name of his ship, becoming the first British navigator to sail the earth. In 1774, John Chapman, more commonly known as Johnny Appleseed, American pioneer nurseryman, introduced apple trees to Pennsylvania, Ontario, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, was born in Leominster, Mass. He died in 1845. In 1820, the famous frontiersman Daniel Boone dies in Missouri. On this day in 1820, the great pioneering frontiersman Daniel Boone dies quietly in his sleep at his son's home near present-day Defiance, Missouri. This amazing character was 86. Boone was born in 1734 to Quaker parents living in Berks County, Pennsylvania. Following a squabble with Pennsylvania Quakers, Boone's family decided to head south and west for less crowded regions, and they eventually settled in the Yadkin Valley of North Carolina. There, the young Daniel Boone began his lifelong love for wilderness, spending long days exploring the still relatively unspoiled forests and mountains of the region. An indifferent student who never learned to write more than a crude sentence or two, Boone's passion was for the outdoors, and he quickly became a superb marksman, hunter, and woodsman. Never satisfied to stay put for long, Boone soon began making ever longer and more ambitious journeys into the relatively unexplored lands to the west. In May of 1769, Boone and 5 companions crossed over the Cumberland Gap and explored along the South Fork of the Kentucky River. Impressed by the fertility and relative emptiness of the land, although native inhabitants hardly considered it to be empty, Boone returned in 1773 with his family, hoping to establish a permanent settlement. An Indian attack prevented that first attempt from succeeding, but Boone returned 2 years later to open the route that became known as Boone's Trace, or the Wilderness Road, between Cumberland Gap and a new settlement along the Kentucky River called Fortress Boonesboro. After years of struggles against the Native Americans and British soldiers, Boonesboro eventually became one of the most important gateways for the early American settlement of the Trans-Appalachian West. Made a legend in his own time by John Filson's Boone autobiography and Lord Byron's depiction of him as the quintessential frontiersman in the book Don Juan, Boone became a symbol of the Western pioneering spirit for many Americans. Ironically, though, Boone's fame and success in opening the Trans-Appalachian West to large-scale settlement later came to haunt him. Having lost his Kentucky land holdings by failing to properly register them, Boone moved even further west in 1799, trying to escape the civilized regions he had been so instrumental in creating. Isn't that just the way it is? Finally settling in Missouri, though he never stopped dreaming of continuing westward, he lived out the rest of his life doing what he loved best, hunting and trapping in a fertile wild land still largely untouched by the Anglo pioneers who had followed the path he blazed to the west. 1849, Ivan Pavlov, Russian psychologist and pioneer in psychology, was born in Russia, of course, since he was Russian. In 1888, T.S. Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri. On this day in 1913, the first boat, a tug known as the U.S. Gatun, is raised in the locks of the Panama Canal. In 1914, the Federal Trade Commission was established. Its principal mission is the promotion of consumer protection and the enforcement of civil, non-criminal, U.S. antitrust law through the elimination and prevention of anti-competitive business practices, such as coercive monopoly. In 1918, at 5:30 in the morning, after a 6-hour-long bombardment over the previous night, more than 700 Allied tanks, followed closely by infantry troops, advanced against the German positions in the Argonne Forest along the Meuse River. On September 26 of 1928, the first day of work at the Galvin Manufacturing Corporation. Work began at Chicago's new Galvin Manufacturing Corporation. The company had officially incorporated the day before. Later on, Galvin would introduce the Motorola radio, the first mass-produced commercial car radio. The name had two parts: motor, which evoked cars and motion, and Ola, derived from Victrola. It was supposed to make people think of music, Motorola. In 1941, the U.S. Army establishes the Military Peace Corps, which is different from the regular Peace Corps. In 1948, Australian singer and actress Olivia Newton-John was born in Cambridge, England. Happy birthday, Olivia. Yikes, on this day in 1955, the New York Stock Exchange suffered a $44 million loss. In 1956, American actress Linda Hamilton was born in Salisbury, Maryland. Happy birthday, Linda. On this day in 1957, Bernstein's West Side Story opens. West Side Story, composed by Leonard Bernstein, opened at the Winter Garden Theater on Broadway. For the groundbreaking musical, Bernstein provided a propulsive and rhapsodic score that many celebrate as his greatest achievement as a composer. However, even without the triumph of West Side Story, Bernstein's place in musical history was firmly established. In addition to his work as a composer, the Renaissance man of music excelled as a conductor, a concert pianist, and a teacher who brought classical music to the masses. On this day in 1960, the Kennedy-Nixon debates began. For the first time in U.S. history, a debate between major party presidential candidates is shown on television. The presidential hopefuls John Kennedy, the Democratic senator of Massachusetts, and Richard Nixon, the vice president of the United States, met in a Chicago studio to discuss U.S. domestic matters. Kennedy was accustomed to being in front of cameras and did pretty well, because he was at ease. But Nixon was a bit more self-conscious and awkward, and so he didn't do very well in those debates, generally speaking, as evidenced by Kennedy's election to the presidency later on. In 1961, 19-year-old Bob Dylan makes his New York singing debut at Gerd's Folk City. Now, he had sung in front of people before, but this was his New York City singing debut. On this day in 1969, what's often considered the Beatles' last album, Abbey Road, was released. It wasn't exactly their final album because Let It Be followed in 1970, but this was the last one that John, Paul, George, and Ringo recorded together as a band. In 1969, oh my gosh, the Brady Bunch. The Brady Bunch premiered. Yep, on this night in 1969, American television audiences heard the soon-to-be famous opening lyrics, "Here's a story of a lovely lady who was living with three very lovely girls." The Brady Bunch, a sitcom that would become an icon of American pop culture, aired for the first time on this day in 1969. September 26, 1971, 4 20-game winners. On September 26, 1971, Baltimore Orioles pitcher Jim Palmer wins his 20th game of the year becoming the fourth Orioles pitcher to win 20 games in the 1971 season. This made the 1971 Orioles pitching staff the first since that of the 1920 Chicago White Sox to field 4 20-game winners. 1971, Richard M. Nixon meets with Emperor Hirohito in Anchorage, Alaska, the first ever meeting of a U.S. president and a Japanese monarch. In 1972, Robert Francis O'Rourke, who likes to call himself Beto, was born in El Paso, Texas. In 1977, Israel announces a ceasefire on the Lebanon border. On this day in 1983, Stanislav Petrov disobeyed procedures and ignored electronic alarms indicating 5 incoming nuclear missiles, believing the U.S. would launch more than 5 if it wanted to start a war. His decision prevented a retaliatory attack that would have begun a nuclear war between the superpowers of the United States and USSR. Good job, Stanislav. In 1996, on this day, Shannon Lucid returns to Earth. On this day in 1996, U.S. astronaut Shannon Lucid returned to Earth in the U.S. Space Shuttle Atlantis, following 6 months in orbit aboard the Russian space station Mir. On this day in 1997, 2 earthquakes struck Italy, causing part of the Basilica of St. Francis to collapse, killing 4 people and destroying much of the cycle of frescoes depicting the saint's life. On this day in 2007, a mistrial was declared in the Phil Spector murder case. Music producer Phil Spector's trial for the murder of actress Lana Clarkson ended in a mistrial when the jury could not come to a unanimous verdict. On this day in 2008, Yves Rossi, a Swiss pilot and inventor, was the first person to fly a jet-powered wing across the English Channel. And that's going to wrap it up for this day's Today in History. As always, the links to all my research are posted in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. Give it a like if you enjoyed this video. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. And feel free to share this video if you found it interesting. There's also a physical address if you want to send me a coffee mug. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Come on now, you can do it. You can do it. I know you can do it. Good girl. Good girl. Okay. Another difficult word. Bartamol Orelo. Don't make me squeak that pig again.